Okay, so we are back and we're continuing our discussion of John Dryden's Macflecknoe. And in our last class, we had been talking about Macflecknoe as essentially mock heroic or mock epic in style, and that this was the principal strategy used in the satire. The satire of the competitor poet, as a competitor of Dryden's, Thomas Shadwell, who is being satirized here by Dryden, who had been bested by Shadwell in competition. Well, in any event, let's just look at a little bit more of this in lines 126 and following. We're talking about the hoary prince in majesty who has appeared now. His temples last with poppies were o'erspread. Why do you suppose there's a reference to poppies? Not the Roman laurels, from the laurel branches of the laurel bush or tree, but poppies? What do we associate with poppies? Yeah. Narcotic effect. They put you to sleep. They put you to sleep. And the poppy was already being used now in the West as something that would have a narcotic effect. His temples last with poppies were o'erspread. That nodding seemed to consecrate his head. Just at that point of time, if fame not lie, on his left hand 12 reverend owls did fly. So Romulus, 'tis sung by Tiber's brook, presage of sway from twice 6 vultures took. The admiring throng loud acclamations make, and omens of his future empire take. The sire then shook the honors of his head, and from his brows damps of oblivion shed. Full on the filial dullness long he stood, repelling from his breast the raging god, at length burst out in his prophetic mood, heavens bless my son, from Ireland let him reign. What do you suppose that's a reference to? This is supposed to be the one who is going to succeed as the master of the realms of dullness. Yeah.
The Irish were stereotypically, I don't know, dull or stupid.
Okay, that's true. In English literature of the time, the Irish are generally treated as either just silly, maybe good-hearted, but silly people who shouldn't be taken seriously. That was the stage Irishman, by the way. It was a stock comic figure on the English stage in the 18th century. Or were put down as really a savage and even barbaric people. And of course, part of the reason for that was blaming the victim, because in the 17th century, as Dryden well knew, the armies of the English had absolutely devastated Ireland and had slaughtered, defenseless women and children and the elderly, along with people who attempted to defend themselves with pointed sticks in many cases. Well, okay. We'll see more examples of that until eventually, toward the latter part of the second half of British literature, we see this incredible renaissance of Irish literature in the 19th and 20th centuries. Okay, well, we get to the end here, and we have Flecknoe formally letting his mantle descend upon his son, Macflecknoe, who, of course, is going to be here our Shadwell, the new emperor of the realms of dullness. And he said, this is the last few lines, he said, but his last words were scarcely heard, for Bruce and Longueville had a trap prepared, and down they sent the yet declaiming bard. Sinking, he left his drugget robe behind. Borne upwards by a subterranean wind, the mantle fell to the young prophet's part with double portion of his father's art. Well, double portion of his father's art is obviously double portion of his father's dullness. Okay, so here we are. The mock epic or mock heroic style. And that, of course, is one way of putting somebody down. We tend to think of a way of putting somebody down as by belittling the person, making the person seem small, right? Oh, so-and-so is just an idiot, or so-and-so is just a mouse, or something or other like that. Well, the mock epic is exactly the opposite. What you do is you put somebody down by exaggerating his or her qualities. The Rape of the Lock. The Rape of the Lock, okay, was done in two different versions. That's why I have the two different dates up here. Pope did an original version of it in 1712, but then he revised it in 1714. Pope was a Roman Catholic at a time when Roman Catholics had few legal rights in England. And they could not own property in their own names, generally speaking, unless they exercised certain dodges so that they could get around the regulations. They couldn't stand for public office. They couldn't vote in elections. In other words, Roman Catholics really officially did not have the same rights as citizens as Protestants did in England at the time. On the other hand, there were some Catholics who were either privileged enough because of their own political connections, or just shrewd enough, politically shrewd enough, that they were able to survive. And even in some cases, a few cases, not a lot, but in a few cases, to flourish. So there was a small Catholic community of people who were upper class and upper middle class in the early 18th century, despite all of the efforts to oppress Roman Catholics at the time. And Pope was a member of that community. Now, with an oppressed community, especially if it's very small, it's extremely important to maintain the unity of the community, right? Because there's the common enemy all around you. And so you can't afford to have rifts in your own group. Well, that's precisely what happened in Pope's time, and that's precisely what provoked his writing, The Rape of the Lock. There was a real social crisis as a result of the Catholic families getting together. Now we're talking about upper and upper middle class families getting together at a social occasion at which there was this young man who apparently was attempting to flirt with a young woman of another one of the families, and begged from her, as part of his flirtation, that she at the very least give him a lock of her hair. And this was something that was frequently done in earlier times between lovers, or sometimes between a husband and wife. And even to this day, in some cases, there are lockets that survive that have little locks of hair in them that have been given to a lover or to a spouse. And so she refused his advances. And so he apparently came up behind her with some scissors and snipped off a lock of her hair. At which point, of course, she started this huge commotion. This, of course, destroyed the social harmony of the occasion, and destroyed or threatened to destroy the harmony of these Catholic families. Now, go back to my original point. When you are a member of a small group which is surrounded by people who are threatening you, I don't mean threatening you with swords over your head, but threatening to take your rights away, your property away, and so forth. It is extremely important to stick together. And so one of the members of this community came to Pope and said, look, isn't there some way that you can write one of your famous satirical poems and you can laugh people out of this? What's happened is they've lost their sense of humor. They've lost a sense of proportion. It's true the guy's an idiot. He never should have done what he did in snipping off a lock of her hair. But after all, it was just a lock of her hair, a little piece of her, the end of her hair. So we can't destroy the whole community over something that trivial. So Pope, in response, wrote The Rape of the Lock. And his mock epic is designed to resolve the crisis, which was a real social and, by extension, political crisis, through humor. And, of course, the very title itself gives way to the premise of his work. The Rape of the Lock. I mean, rape is a very, 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 very serious offense and a very serious crime. But after all, to use the term rape for what has just taken place, you see, is itself extreme. Okay, so in Canto 1, this is divided into 5 cantos. In Canto 1, we're going to look at the epic poetic diction in just a moment. Notice the celestial machinery. In Homer, Virgil, and Milton, what do we have? We have all kinds of supernatural figures involved, don't we? In Homer and Virgil, you literally have the gods constantly intervening in human affairs. That's what celestial machinery means. And in Milton's Paradise Lost, we likewise do, don't we? We don't just have Adam and Eve alone in the garden. We have Satan, we have the archangels, we have in heaven God and the Son of God, and so forth. And all of this, of course, is taken over in a humorous way from the real epic tradition. And then we have the action, the whole action of Canto 1 is reduced to what? Belinda, who is the victim of the work, Belinda waking up and putting on her makeup. That's all that happens with all of this very elaborate epic language and machinery. Now, let's look at some of this in Canto 1. What dire offense from amorous causes springs? What mighty contests rise from trivial things? I sing this verse to Carl, Muse is due. Carl is the guy who asked him to write the poem, asked Pope to write the poem. This even Belinda may vouchsafe to view. Slight is the subject, but not so the praise, if she inspire and he approve my lays. Say what strange motive, goddess, could compel a well-bred lord to assault a gentle belle. Goddess, the muse, sing heavenly muse. Okay, remember Milton? Calling upon the muse to sing through him with divine inspiration, just as Virgil had done before him, just as Homer had done before Virgil. Oh, say what stranger cause, yet unexplored, could make a gentle belle reject a lord. In tasks so bold can little men engage, and in soft bosoms dwells such mighty rage. Of course, Pope is just having fun here with all of this. Saul, of course, is the son. Through white curtains shot a timorous ray, and oped those eyes that must eclipse the day. The eyes that must eclipse the day, those eyes that are like suns themselves, and in their radiance eclipse even the brightness of the day. See how he's playing with the conceits of the poetry that we've seen earlier. My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun, etc., etc., etc. Okay? Now lapdogs give themselves the rousing shake, and sleepless lovers just at 12 elate. Just at 12? We're talking about a leisure class, in which it was common, by the way, among this leisure class in the 18th century, to arise sometime around noon, to get oneself more or less together by maybe about 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock, to be ready to receive guests around 4, and to go off to dinner or a ball that would usually start around 10. And of course, would go on well past midnight, which is why people would get home in the small hours of the morning, which is why they wouldn't be getting up the next morning until around 12. Well, most of us obviously could not afford to do that sort of thing, but this is a leisure class to a very large extent, at any rate. Thrice rung the bell, the slipper knocked the ground, and the pressed watch returned a silver sound. Belinda still her downy pillow pressed, her guardian sylph prolonged the balmy rest. 'Twas he had summoned to her silent bed the morning dream that hovered o'er her head, etc., etc. Well, okay, let's recognize, of course, that we've got all these unnumbered spirits around her flying. And this is like the angels, by the way, in Paradise Lost. And Pope, by the way, is deliberately echoing lines from Paradise Lost at times. And people, of course, would recognize that. And that would be part of the fun of the work. Okay, so Ariel, by the way, is the principal one among these. But Ariel makes a warning in 105 and following. Ariel is my name. He's a watchful sprite or spirit. Late as I range the crystal wilds of air, in the clear mirror of thy ruling star, I saw, alas, some dread event impend, ere to the main this morning sun descend, but heaven reveals not what or how or where. Warned by the sylph, O pious maid, beware. This to disclose is all thy guardian care. Beware of all, but most beware of man. Well, again, this is fun, okay? The warning from the spirit who has a supernatural revelation, who comes to warn Belinda. Well, then we have her getting up. 121 and following. And now unveiled, the toilet stands displayed. Toilet doesn't mean toilet in our sense of toilet. It means the vanity. You know what a vanity is, right? Vanity, usually a little table with a mirror over it, where a woman might sit and put on her makeup. And of course, that's what's about to happen. And now unveiled the toilet stands displayed, each silver vase in mystic order laid, with a kind of religious connotation. First, robed in white, the nymph intent adores, robed in white as a priestess. as a priestess in some kind of religious ritual. The nymph intent adores, and what is she adoring? With head uncovered, as appropriate apparently for some sort of religious ritual. What does she adore with head uncovered? The cosmetic powers. She's got all her makeup laid out there, the cosmetic powers. A heavenly image in the glass appears. Well, of course, it's her own image, right? A heavenly image in the glass appears. To that she bends, to that her eyes she rears. And of course, this is what she is worshiping, is her own image in the glass, in the mirror. The inferior priestess, this is her maid, by the way, this was the inferior priestess. At her altar's side, and here it becomes explicit that the vanity is her altar. Trembling begins the sacred rites of pride. The sacred rites of pride. Unnumbered treasures ope at once, and here the various offerings of the world appear. From each she nicely culls with curious foil, and decks the goddess with the glittering spoil. See, her oils and whatnot, you know, from all over the world. Because England, of course, had become a great commercial center by this time. And they were able to import things from China and India and Africa and Central America and North America and so on and so on and so on. Okay. From each she nicely culls with curious foil and decks the goddess. The goddess whose image has appeared now in the mirror with the glittering spoil. This casket India's glowing gems unlocks, and all Arabia breathes from yonder box. The tortoise here and elephant unite, transformed to combs, the speckled and the white. And of course that's intended to be silly. And what do we have here? We've got, I don't know if you remember this or not, or if any of you grew up with around this, tortoiseshell. Now it's imitated in certain plastics, you know, where you can have a plastic mirror, a plastic comb, plastic brush. At one time they were made literally out of tortoise shell. And of course, the elephant would be what? Ivory. See, all of these things now, for what? For the vanity of this young woman. Here files of pins, these are hairpins, extend their shining rows, puffs, powders, patches, Bibles, billy-do. Well, you know, you could look at the footnote and there's been a suggestion that, you know, maybe this is not Bible in our usual sense of Bible, but maybe it is. Maybe it is. Billy-do, by the way, are notes from lovers. Notes from lovers, or would-be lovers. Okay? And notice everything is just indiscriminately there. Puffs, powders, patches, Bibles, billy-do. Now awful beauty puts on all its arms. Awful in the sense of capable of inspiring awe. Inspiring awe. And notice capital B, beauty. The fair each moment rises in her charms, repairs her smiles, awakens every grace, and calls forth all the wonders of her face. You know, cosmetic ads don't say, usually, do they, that, you know, they're going to make you beautiful. Don't they usually say something like, they're going to bring out the natural beauty that is you? Right? Well, that's what Pope is having fun with here. The cosmetic industry had already begun and was flourishing at this time. Okay, and notice repairs her smiles. Well, indeed. and awakens every grace. Sees by degrees a purer blush arise, a purer blush as she's putting on her rouge, and keener lightning quicken in her eyes. You see, as she puts on eye makeup. Okay, so each stage of putting on her makeup, you see, something else is coming alive. Well, okay. Have you ever seen in older movies, sometimes they will, older movies which are based on 18th and 19th century novels or plays, you know, the woman will pause before the mirror and pinch her cheeks to make the blood flood into her cheeks. Well, that was the substitute for rouge, of course, you know, because there were households in which women were forbidden to put on makeup. So this is one way of getting around it. But in any event, the blush, the purer blush arise. The busy sylphs surround their darling care. These set the head, those divide the hair. Some fold the sleeve, while others plait the gown. And Betty's praised for labors not her own. Betty is the maid, but praised for labors not her own because there are these supernatural creatures who are surrounding Belinda and making all of this happen. Well, okay. Then we move on to Canto 2. We have Ariel's address to the assembled spirits, and then we're going to look at a particular poetic device here in just a moment. But notice how Canto 2 begins. Not with more glories in the ethereal plain the sun first rises, or the purpled main. I mean, that sounds like it's coming out of Virgil. Then issuing forth the rival of his beams, launched on the bosom of the silver Thames. Well, this is echoing for people who knew their classical literature, Aeneas's voyage up the Tiber River. Well, okay. And we go on here. Let's look at Ariel's address, which begins in 73 and following. He's addressing the assembled fairy creatures, all these sylphs and sylphids and so forth, as higher spirits. They come from the province of the sylphs or the fairies. And then we have in 105 and following, this is still part of his speech. You know, these are things to be alert to, dangers to be alerted to. Whether the nymph shall break Diana's law, well, Diana's law is the law of chastity, Diana being, of course, the goddess of chastity. Whether the nymph shall break Diana's law, or notice how these things are equated, or some frail china jar receive a flaw. See the equating of those? You see the nymph losing her virginity or discovering some flaw in a piece of china? Well, you see the irony in all of this. Or stain her honor, something fairly serious, or her new brocade, her new dress. As if these things were equivalent. Forget her prayers or miss a masquerade, or lose her heart or necklace at a ball. Now see, all of these equations here are clearly ironic, and that's all part of the satire. So, we move on, awaiting the impending fate in Canto 3. The card game I have down here is an epic agon. An agon is a struggle between epic figures. Typically, it's either wrestling, like Grendel and Beowulf, or it's fighting with weapons as Achilles and Hector. But it's a struggle, and it's an epic struggle. And then, of course, we have the disaster of the cutting of the lock. And then we're going to look particularly at the epic similes in lines 157 and following. This is a device that comes out of Homer and runs through Virgil. You find it in Milton and elsewhere in epic literature. And it's best illustrated by just going to the lines themselves. Okay, let's start with the 146.7. 147, this is in Canto 3. The peer. Peers are members of the nobility, by the way. The peer now spreads the glittering forefix, these are scissors, by the way, wide to enclose the lock, now joins it to divide. Even then, before the fatal engine closed, a wretched sylph too fondly interposed, fate urged the shears and cut the sylph in twain, but airy substance soon unites again. The meeting points the sacred hair to sever from the fair head forever and forever. Okay, this is the description of him cutting a little piece of her hair. I mean, we're not talking about shaving her head, by the way. We're talking about a little, lock at the end of long hair. And this is a time when, if you look at the paintings of women in the 18th century, I mean, women wore long hair. I mean, really, not long hair down to their waist, but, long curling hair. Then flashed the living lightning from her eyes. The screams of horror rend the affrighted skies. I mean, it's as if, Mount Etna has erupted. Not louder shrieks to pitying heaven are cast when husbands or when lapdogs breathe their last. And see the irony there? The shrieks, you see. Not louder shrieks to pitying heaven are cast when husbands or when lapdogs breathe their last, or when rich china vessels, fallen from high, in glittering dust and painted fragments lie. China, by the way, now is becoming more and more, I don't mean the country China, but yeah, in a way the country China. But China, the stuff that you have, cups and saucers and pitchers and whatnot, was increasingly being imported from China and elsewhere in the Far East. Let wreaths of triumph now my temples twine, the victor cried, the glorious prize is mine. While fish in streams the birds delight in air, or in a coach and six the British fair, as long as Atlantis shall be read, or the small pillow grace a lady's bed, while visits shall be paid on solemn days, when numerous wax lights in bright order blaze, while nymphs take treats or assignations give, so long my honor, name, and praise shall live. What time would spare from steel receives its date, and monuments like men submit to fate. Steel could the labor of the gods destroy, and strike to dust the imperial towers of Troy. And notice this is a simile comparing this event here to the fall of Troy, right? Steel could the works of mortal pride confound, and hew triumphal arches to the ground. What wonder then, fair nymph, thy hairs should feel the conquering force of unresisted steel. Let me write this on the tablet, please. Let me make sure I'm on this. Okay. You know what a simile is, right? What is a simile in poetry, typically? What is a simile? Anybody? It's a comparison. Yeah, it's a comparison. It's what in logical terms we call an analogy. This is like that, okay? Well, there is such a thing as the epic. The epic simile, where, for example, you know, the event, whatever it is, let's say some horrible catastrophe, is compared to some epic, horrible catastrophe, you know, like the exploding of Mount Etna, say, okay? Now here, epic similes are used in a comic way, because this is mock epic, right? Or mock heroic poetry. Okay, so let's go on to Canto 4. We have now something that frequently enough happens in epic, a descent into the underworld. Here, the cave of spleen. And spleen was supposed to be the organ in which some of the darker passions and darker emotions would reside. A descent into the underworld. In Virgil's Aeneid, there's a point in which Aeneas, having left Troy and then having left Carthage and leaving behind his beloved Dido, who commits suicide as a result, he is privileged to have a descent into the underworld, where he receives special revelations not normally given to humans, which open up to him the future history and the glories of the future history of Rome. We have Umbriel as a presiding sprite or fairy figure, who is not unlike some of the figures in a kind of parody that we find in Milton. And we're going to see at the very beginning of this an outdoing topos, what we now call an outdoing topos, saying this is even greater than that. She is even more beautiful than Helen. He is even stronger than Samson. Okay? He is even braver than Achilles. She is even more pure than Diana. Okay? In other words, one thing outdoes another. And the thing that it outdoes is of heroic or epic proportion. For a woman to be described as even more beautiful than Helen, well, maybe than heaven too, than Helen, is to say it's beyond language to say how beautiful she really is. Or to say that someone is stronger than Samson, is to say that this is beyond the reach of my language to describe. Okay, so let's look at the beginning then of Canto 4 and see how this works. But anxious cares the pensive nymph oppressed, and secret passions labored in her breast. Not youthful kings in battle seized alive, not scornful virgins who their charms survive, which of course is ironic in itself. Not ardent lovers robbed of all their bliss, not ancient ladies when refused a kiss. Notice how all these things are equated. Not tyrants fierce that unrepenting die, not Cynthia when her manteaus pinned awry, ever felt such rage, resentment, and despair as thou, said virgin, for thy ravished hair. Thy ravished hair? Thy ravished hair? Again, see the irony here in the satire. Now, this is not biting, harsh satire, though, is it? I mean, he's having fun, but he's not really putting people down in a really harsh way. We often distinguish between two different kinds of satire. If I can go back to the tablet here, let me do this, erase this. Traditionally, the names are the names of Roman poets. And I'll just put these down, but just so you know what the difference is. This is after the Roman poet Horace. These are two kinds of satire. Either Horatian, which is good-humored. It's the kind of thing that in general we have here. And then there's Juvenalian. After the Roman poet Juvenal, which is harsh, even bitter. Now, Macfagno certainly tends more towards the Juvenalian, doesn't it? I mean, that's really harsh. I mean, he's really slamming Thomas Shadwell in that poem. Whereas here, Pope is not really slamming these people, is he? I mean, it's done in a much lighter, more humorous vein. Because after all, what he wants to do is not make enemies. He's trying to get people to redevelop a sense of proportion. Just say, okay, yes, it's true. This imbecile shouldn't have done what he did, but nonetheless, it was, after all, only the cutting off of a little piece of her hair. And yes, he should apologize. And yes, he should do everything he can to make it up with the families. That's true. But let's keep things in proportion. Let's keep things in scale. So he wants to exercise good humor to do so. Okay, Canto 5, then. Provides us with the moral. Only good humor can prevail. And maybe not every one of life's problems, but an awful lot of life's problems could be solved if we simply retain our balance and a kind of reasonable good humor. So that here the epic battle between Belinda and the Baron or peer is reduced to her throwing snuff at him and threatening him with a hairpin. Not a sword, but a hairpin. And then at the end, Belinda's lock ascends to the heavens to become a star, even as she is immortalized by the poem. So, let's go to look at a little bit of this. The beginning of Canto 5. She said, the pitying audience melt in tears, but fate and Jove had stopped the Baron's ears. Well, notice all these classical allusions. This is neo-classicism, right? Something that, in a sense, had begun in the Renaissance, but now is taken even farther than it had been taken during the Renaissance, and so forth. Say, why are beauties praised? This is in the next verse paragraph there, around line 9. Say, why are beauties praised and honored most? The wise man's passion and the vain man's toast? Why decked with all that land and sea afford? Why angels called and angel-like adored? Why round our coaches crowd the white-gloved beaux? You know what that's an image of, right? Why round our coaches, people riding in coaches, of course. We're talking about people of the upper classes. Riding in coaches, these are women, by the way. Why round our coaches crowd the white-gloved beaux. You know what a beau is. Boyfriend, would-be lover, perhaps. White-gloved. Okay. Why bows the side box from its inmost rows, the side box at the theater? People who are up in the boxes are in the most expensive seats. They're also in the most visible seats. And then we get to the moral of the whole story. How vain are all these glories, all our pains, unless good sense preserve what beauty gains. That men may say, when we the front box grace, behold the first in virtue as in face. Behold the first in virtue as in face. And that's really the moral of the whole poem. Okay? Forget all of these silly, superficial vanities, and let us try to cultivate some kind of true virtue and be reasonable people, after all, who have common sense and good humor, and we should be able to overcome our problems. And so that then once again is how the poem ends, with its epic image of the loch now become a star. So, on to next time.